Welcome everyone to MailFuzz TV. I am Peter, and today I'm going to be talking about Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, Season 1, Episode 1. It is called A Shadow of the Past. It's an Episode 1, so I'll start spoiler-free. I imagine it'll probably mostly be spoiler-free anyway, because I don't necessarily have much to say about the plot per se. And the first thing I should probably talk about with this show is where I'm coming from with this, my bias, if you will. Because I do not typically like fantasy. I'm not a big fantasy guy in pretty much any medium, and I specifically don't really like the Lord of the Rings movies that much. I respect them well enough, the original trilogy, for its, like, you know, all the craft that went into it and how much of a spectacle it is, but fundamentally I just find the story kind of dull and boring, and I don't like the Hobbit movies really at all. They're a bit more sort of hollow and just full of CG set pieces, as opposed to the mixture of practical and CG that the original trilogy had, and all the rest of it. But so, you know, from a craft perspective, I can respect them, but I don't really enjoy watching them all that much. And it's been a long time, so I don't really know Lord of the Rings lore all that much. I'm not really interested in it because I don't tend to be interested in fantasy lore. I'm watching this because it ranked on the top spot of this month's Patreon pilot vote. Every month at patreon.com/MailFuzzTV, the voting tier at the $10 tier, you know, all the pilots, well, not all, but most of the ones that seem of interest will go up for a vote, and they'll be ranked in priority. This was number one, so I had to talk about it. I had to watch the first episode and talk about it. I think the first two went out on release today, but I only watched the first one. I was not committing to any more than that. But I'll give my thoughts the best I can. I will try and separate my taste from objective critiques, and then sort of go from there. But you know, I'm pointing out where I'm coming from with this, because I'm making it clear. I'm being upfront about it. You should not be coming to me to see like if other fantasy fans will like it, unless you want to deduce that if I don't like it, it means you will like it because I don't like fantasy. I mean, maybe you could argue that. But this is not a fantasy fan or Lord of the Rings fan's review of this in any way, shape, or form. It's someone who actively dislikes that stuff. So, what are my thoughts on this first episode? Obviously, the production value is pretty high. You know, I'll get that out there right away. It looks very high quality. Obviously, there's a lot of green screen stuff, but for the most part, it looked pretty good. It didn't feel super artificial most of the time. There are things here or there. It is kind of insane now. We're at this point where they're making these blockbuster TV shows that do rival what movies do. In fact, if you compare this to some modern movies, like the Marvel movies have been pretty rough on like effects for a little while now. So this is actually sort of above the movie standard of some recent stuff. But as far as what this show kind of focuses on, like I say, I'm not a big lore guy when it comes to this stuff, but it sets up that in a sort of extended prologue montage with some backstory narration and things like that, that the elves had to leave their land to fight this war on Middle-earth with the army of orcs led by Sauron. I heard Sauron's name a lot during this, and that war went on for a long time, and it's believed to be over, but our main character, Galadriel, she believes that there's still some out there. There's still orcs, there's still Sauron, and the opening of the show kind of has her finding evidence to this effect. But no one wants to believe it. Everyone wants to believe that the war's over, and they want to go back to their home country, their homeland. And there's a lot of like fallout from this war kind of shown throughout, where some of the humans in Middle-earth are kind of like under watch from the elven army because of their past supporting the evil side. I can't remember. Nolgarth? Garth from Wayne's World? I can't remember what the name of the evil force was that Sauron was working for, but like so there's a lot of humans fought on that side. So you know, our main characters are Galadriel, who she, you know, believes this threat's still out there, that Sauron's coming back, and is kind of flying in the face of everyone else. We have an elfin soldier who seems to have fallen into a relationship with a human woman, which is frowned upon, and that sort of brings them some drama. And there's some other hints that things are coming. There's some Hobbit-like characters, which I actually asked on Twitter if these were hobbits or if they were like a separate, similar, small tree-faring people. Turns out they're maybe predecessors to hobbits, and it might actually be because of like some rights issues as to why they're not just hobbits. But that's just from a quick check on Twitter. I was just making sure that I wasn't missing something. But yeah, so we have them, and that's kind of our main batches of characters. Galadriel's stuff, like she has a friend in the current sort of like capital of Elf land, whatever we're calling it, and he's kind of like pretty high up. He's just under the King Elf, and the King Elf's kind of determined to push this narrative that the war's over, it's the peacetime, we can all go back home now. But there's all these like signs throughout the episode that something's brewing. Crops dying somewhere, a bit of a sickness getting into some animals, and it's like, okay, bad times are maybe just on the cusp of happening again, which makes sense because it's the start of a TV show. It'd be kind of weird to have all this war in the backstory and then say, oh no, the TV show's set during peacetime. So obviously this episode's about building the intrigue that there's something coming and that we're going to be doing all this. I mean, my broad complaints as someone who doesn't like fantasy, and it all kind of is still true here. I don't particularly like the dialogue in stories like this. I don't like the and it's funny because I'm not a fan of Shakespeare, and I think a lot of my dislike of Shakespeare kind of extends to fantasy in a lot of ways, because there's kind of this very flowery dialogue that's given, this sort of attempt to be kind of regal and posh to the elves, and like I'm just not particularly fond of it, and I find myself, my eyes glazing over a little bit when they're talking. Of course, there's also a lot of made up names and places and just terms that are being thrown around willy nilly, and I always feel a little bit at odds whenever I try to start off into a new fantasy world. And yeah, this isn't new to everyone, obviously, but I've not seen the Lord of the Rings movies in such a long time, and I never really cared for them, so there's no way I retained much beyond just Middle Earth, Sauron, Gollum, and there was like tree people at one point. like my memories of those movies are pretty are pretty gone at this point. So yeah, like my general complaint of that stuff is still there. Like I still find the conversations quite tedious to get through, and I'm not someone who is like excited by all the little drops of lore. I think what is funny about this though is normally I would maybe start a show review like this one and talk about how I feel about prequels, because this is effectively a prequel. It's set before Lord of the Rings. Interestingly, there's a weird advantage this has for me specifically compared to other prequels, in that I don't really remember Lord of the Rings well enough to notice when they're doing wink wink, nudge nudge, we're teasing the canon that is to come, because I don't remember most of it, so I don't really remember, I don't notice if they're teasing specific things or not, which is normally what I hate about prequels, other than just having a hard time lifting the stakes because it's kind of a foregone conclusion of where it's going. And also because sometimes backstory should just be backstory and not be like stretched out into a full narrative. On top of all that, you usually have this kind of, we have to tease, we have to put in Easter eggs, we have to have all this knowing wink wink kind of attitude to the big events and characters that are to come down the line. So luckily, because I don't remember Lord of the Rings, I'm not really noticing here, so someone else is going to have to tell you if there's a lot of that. If I did notice that, I would be complaining about it, but I didn't because I don't remember it, so maybe it's not doing it. Maybe that's true. I think maybe more objectively, this episode is a full hour or so long, and I don't really think it needed to be quite that long. There's a little bit of repetition with Galadriel's kind of objection to like giving up the idea that there's still an enemy out there. A few conversations that go back and forth in that way, and it's setting up the ideas of the show. Like I'm not necessarily complaining that it's doing a kind of re-elaborating some of its core like character dynamics quite early on. In fact, they were playing it so heavily that I wasn't even convinced that they were going to like, I think by the end of the episode it's clear that we're really about to start this evil force is coming kind of thing. I almost thought it wasn't going to be that quick because it felt like, oh, we're really setting up like the doubt and the whatever. But then it kind of almost accelerates a bit too quickly right at the end of the episode, when a lot of the episode feels like it's plodding through a little bit for me. So I did feel the length. I imagine though, if you are someone who salivates over the details of everything that's going on, then maybe you'll be enthralled to be in this world for a full hour. I think from a constructive point of view, like, it's setting up all its various characters, and it's not doing a terrible job of doing it, right? It sets up this elf soldier who seems to be fallen for a human woman, and the one guy who's near him who knows this, his partner is telling him that he shouldn't do this, and then it just leads to bad news. And ultimately, because the peace has been declared and war is officially over after all this time, they're all going home, so he's going to be taken away from his outpost and never see her again. And that's kind of, simple, effective part of his drama to kind of set that up. And that's okay. I think some of that plays off a little bit better, if not it's particularly exciting or original, just because it's not necessarily all exposition dumps. But some of it is, like when he's talking to his partner and his partner starts talking about how, oh, every time a human or elf has tried it in history, it's led to bad things, probably death. He has like a sort of little speech about it. It does kind of revert back into just a lot of exposition. And, the start of this episode is a lot of exposition. It's very much, there's a montage playing out to show you bits and pieces of it, but it's mostly narration, just explaining things. And that's something Lord of the Rings did as well, and it's also something I don't like about Lord of the Rings. Sometimes, obviously you need to set up your world a little bit, and this is something, science fiction does this sometimes, and I love science fiction. For whatever reason, as much as you could compare science fiction and fantasy worlds, something about sci-fi just clicks much better for me. Maybe it's just the different ways the characters talk, maybe it's the different mechanics that are used, I don't know. But something about all this history that you get in something like Lord of the Rings and Middle Earth, with the fact that there's basically an encyclopedia of which this show has been somewhat taken from and built around or out of. If there's that much backstory in the world, it almost doesn't excite me about it. It actually turns me away from it because it feels kind of impenetrable, and I don't necessarily get excited by that. So yeah, there's some exposition heavy moments here or there. I don't necessarily know how effective some of the characters are overall. Like, again, this is kind of hard to separate between my taste and then just kind of an objective, like, is this character working kind of thing. I found the elf who's like the friend of Galadriel, who's like, working close to the king. I felt like he was kind of unlikable, and maybe I think he's maybe supposed to be a little bit, because he's towing the company line, and he's telling her that she has to accept, what the king's saying, and that she shouldn't make trouble. So, but he comes off especially kind of unlikable to me. And I wasn't necessarily sure if that was, I don't know if it was meant to be more like sympathetic than that. But it was just, that said though, it was kind of the same with the opening with Galadriel and her big brother. I didn't really feel much because for like her loss of her brother and feeling upset that he died in the war and all that, and that's not a spoiler, that's the opening of the show, that's like the backstory for her, is that her big brother went off and fought in this war while she was growing up. And they're elves, so they're like, the elf soldier who's in love with the earth woman, the human woman, is like 79. Well, he's not even 79 years old. He says he's been serving here for 79 years, I think. So that gives you a sense of the timescales here. So yeah, this is tough. Like, the patrons want me to review this because they think it's going to be painful and that I'm going to rant and rave. And I don't know if there's anything to rant and rave about in this specifically. I think this is perfectly serviceable as what it is for the audience that wants it. But painfully dull for me. And, I don't... And that's not an entertaining review. Like, I'm trying to think of things to make this be more exciting or or have a bit more humor in it or a bit more comedy. I don't even have much that I want to make fun of per se, because it's very much just fantasy 101. You know, there's groups of characters with torches going into an ice cave, and there's like some monster roaming about in the background, which was okay. That's like horror in a tomb kind of stuff, and like I can kind of fantasy when it veers more to horror, I can get into it a little bit more. But I'm not really all that enthralled with it. But it's typical fantasy stuff 101. It's what a lot of Dungeons and Dragons campaigns will be full of, is scenarios like that. But then we have to do the other stuff though. We have to do the elven sort of like ceremony, the politics of all this, and I've never really, and it's the same. This is partly why I also don't like Star Wars lore that much. Like the original Star Wars trilogy is fine, but I hate anything with the Jedi Council. So anything with the Elf King, talking to people and making speeches about the war being over, also just kind of puts me to sleep. So I don't really have, as far as like broad critiques. The pacing feeling a bit sluggish and it maybe being a little exposition heavy is kind of my core, what I think are objective complaints. And maybe that the characters, I don't necessarily think are that interesting. Again, that may be something that people who like this sort of stuff disagree with. But I felt kind of generic tropes in the characters, with the forbidden romance and all that other stuff. But like I can't, there's nothing about it that's laughably bad. There's nothing about it that I can sit here and rave about and rant and rave and make fun of because it's doing something stupid or doing something silly. This is almost the hardest type of thing for me to review, and I am so disconnected from the material, but it's not laughably bad, so I can't like tear it to shreds because it's not that bad. It's just like the word that keeps coming at my head is dull. I just find this very dull, but I don't necessarily think that fans of this material are going to find it dull. We're in this era now of doing these prestige TV shows, and I think what's interesting is there was a time when you thought of like a cable, and to an extent streaming, but cable was first. You had this cable, prestige TV show kind of that started with The Sopranos and things like that, and you think of these HBO shows, and for a time there was this kind of like, oh, you can't go wrong going down that route. And I think as times went on, obviously so many like streaming and cable places exist now, and they're trying to do these big shows that you do find ones where they've got these huge production values, but the actual characters feel a little bit tropey and generic, and we're doing very typical romance stuff or whatever else. The actual narrative isn't that really deep or exciting. And maybe that's the other complaint I would say here, is that if you're not enamored with the lore of Lord of the Rings, I don't know if the story here is particularly intriguing or exciting on its own. So if I'm going to levy another objective complaint to it, is that I don't think that the actual build to the big great evil coming feels anything inspired or new or unique. It doesn't do anything to sort of make you go, oh, like I think for people who care about Lord of the Rings, it's like, oh, Sauron's out there and he's building something and there's going to be more evil from him coming and yada yada. But I don't necessarily think like anything that teases with Sauron in this episode is actually that exciting or scary, where you feel the impact of it coming, and you feel this kind of this fear or tension or excitement from it. It feels just a little bit by the numbers to me. And again, with the caveat, I say this as someone who's not into this lore or fantasy, so maybe other people will get more out of it than I do. But this to me feels like I'm trying to think of a good comparison show to give it to give it something that is comparative for me, that's something that I should like but don't necessarily feel that excited about, because it's Altered Carbon. Is that a good one to bring up? That's a science fiction show set in the future about androids or people swapping bodies and stuff like that, and people being downloaded into new bodies so they don't die. Like that on paper sounds like my sort of thing, but then when you actually watch that Netflix show, you very quickly kind of feel just, oh, it's just really typical detective tropes, and there's nothing. It's got all this glossy stuff and it's got this glossy futuristic city around it, but I don't necessarily feel any actual narrative intrigue from anything it's doing. The character work doesn't feel that strong, or it's just the characters feel quite bland because it's not a character focused show. And I think that's one of the things that prestige TV needs. I think most good prestige TV, and maybe there's exceptions that people might point out to me, but most good prestige TV is great because it is a good character study, right? And it's not necessarily fair to, compare every show to, say, a Better Call Saul, but that just finished. And what made that show great, obviously, is the strong rating and direction and all the other things, but the reason why it was strong rating, the number one thing that made the rating strong, was that every single thing was about exploring the characters and what makes them tick, what's motivating them at every single point. And here this is a much lighter show. It's a much lighter thing, and that's not necessarily bad, but I don't necessarily have any interest in a light fantasy show, and I don't think it does anything to pull me into the story. On its craft, if that makes sense. Like, this is something for people who already like fantasy. I think if you don't like fantasy, it's going to do nothing to convince you or pull you in. It's just going to feel kind of hollow. So that's it. That's all I've got. I think that's all I've got to say on the Lord of the Rings of Power debut episode. Needless to say, I will not be watching anymore. There'd be no point in me watching it. I would have nothing to say past this episode. I really wouldn't. So there you go. That's the Lord of the Rings episode. Do let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. Like, subscribe, ding the bell for notifications, all that stuff. Get me on the Twitters for mail_fuzz for channel updates, or of course you can support everything by the super thanks button, or go over to patreon.com/mailfuzztv and supporting everything over there. But that is me, so thank you very much once again for watching or listening. I always appreciate it. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?